I just want to say that I'm Jonathan Santlofer, and I have to do with Crime Fiction Academy, and it's great to be here. And there are many writers that I'm really proud to introduce, but I'm particularly excited and honored to introduce Michael Connelly because, now, how many people can I insult when I say this? He is actually my favorite crime fiction writer. All right. You know, just change that line a little when you talk to the other writers. But all of those other writers are also my favorite writers. But, you know, to me, Michael Connelly's books embody what every good novel should be and few are, which is great stories beautifully written. Every time I read a Michael Connelly novel, and I think I've read all of them, I learn something about structure and plot, about developing character. He's the writer I actually turn to when I get stuck. I write notes in his books, which is kind of funny. I was going to give him one, and then I thought, why would you want to see this? He's the writer I recommend to friends and to students here all the time. So 50 million copies of Michael Connelly's books have been sold worldwide, translated into 39 languages. He has won the Edgar, the Anthony, the McCafferty, the LA Times Best Mystery Thriller Award, the Seamus, the Dillis, the Nero, the Barry, the Audie, the Ridley, the Maltese Falcon in Japan, the 38 Caliber and Grand Prix Awards in France. I'm going to stop at that of the awards. I was interested to read this, that in college, Michael discovered Raymond Chandler and decided that's what he wanted to do and be, a writer. And it's interesting because I've said, and I know a few of my students could quote this, that I've said Michael Connelly is, to me, our contemporary Raymond Chandler, except for one thing, that Michael can actually write a plot. I happen to love Raymond Chandler, but you read them and tell me what they're about, okay? Many people who know and have read Michael Connelly know that he's worked as a reporter specializing in crime. He wrote his first novel, The Black Echo, in 1992, introducing one of the great characters, not only in crime fiction, in fiction, I think, Hieronymus Harry Bosch. That novel won the Edgar Edgar Award for the best first novel. He followed it up with 3 more Bosch novels, The Black Ice, The Concrete Blonde, and The Last Coyote. And now I'm going to skip because there are a lot of books. So in 1996, he published one of my favorite books, one of the most astonishing and beautiful serial killer novels I've ever read. I don't mean that as a joke at all. Not even a little. I think it is an absolutely stunningly beautiful book. In 1998, he wrote Bloodwork, also a great novel. Should have been a great movie. But that, you know. Oh, he also went on to write such books. I tend to mention the ones that struck me the most, but for some reason. A Darkness More Than Light, City of Bones, Chasing the Dime, The Narrows, The Closers, Echo Park, all of them named by the LA Times as best books of the year, many of them notable books from the New York Times. In 2005, he wrote his first legal thriller, The Lincoln Lawyer, which introduced Mickey Haller. And actually, that one became quite a good movie with Matthew McConaughey. Yeah. Since then, he's written such books as The Scarecrow, The Reversal, The Fifth Witness, The Drop, and The Black Box. And his most recent novel, which we have here, I think along with some others, The Gods of Guilt, brings Mickey Haller, the lawyer from the Lincoln Lawyer, back. It's a really great book. I just finished it today. I'm a very good student. Last year, speaking from this podium, Lee Child said that he felt and he believed that crime fiction writers and all writers, that the first line, the first paragraph, the first page of your book has to engage the reader full on, has to be perfect. So I'm going to read you one very short paragraph from Michael Connelly's book, The Poet. And this is how it begins. How's this for a first line? Death is my beat. I make my living from it. I forge my professional reputation on it. I treat it with the passion and precision of an undertaker, somber and sympathetic about it when I'm with the bereaved, a skilled craftsman with it when I'm alone. I've always thought the secret of dealing with death was to keep it at arm's length. That's the rule. Don't let it breathe in your face. But my rule didn't protect me. Now, if you tell me that you're not going to read the rest of this book, it's an amazing book. So if you've not read a Michael Connelly book, let me say that at the end of this, not the Crime Fiction Academy students who are going to go upstairs and kidnap Michael from the snowstorm, but the rest of you are please going to go in the back, buy Gods of Guilt or another Michael Connelly book, get him to sign it. He's here. It's a great opportunity. And now we're going to move up here, and I will finally stop talking.
You know, before you ask a question, I just want to say I wish my editor had been here to hear that introduction, because we went around and around with that line, "Death is my beat," and he wanted to cut it, and he thought it was too much of like an old-fashioned way of starting the book. And it was only my 5th book, so I was still in a stage where I was more often giving in than fighting battles, and when it came to editing. But that was the first fight. I would not stand down. I said I gotta keep that line, because it came out of my life as a reporter, and that's the way I felt long before I wrote the book or wrote that line. And so it stayed in there. And then Stephen King wrote this book on writing, which is a great book. And in that he mentions the first line of the poet being so good. So when I heard about that, I sent that as a Christmas present to my editor.
There's nothing like that kind of revenge to me.
Yeah.
But it's a
I call it affirmation. I'm not a revengeful type guy, but I sure wish he was here.
Well, we're going to call him anyway.
Yeah.
But a couple of things. I think that first paragraph, it feels like Chandler, it feels like Mickey Spillane at his best, it feels like a lot of other people, but it also, like when I say something, when I think something really like gives me shivers and it's really great, it's kind of like, it's familiar, but it's new. You haven't really read it before, and it evokes, like when somebody is at the top of their craft and really doing something beautifully, it has that other history. Of course it does, But anyhow, so you mentioned about being a journalist, and so it's a very obvious question, but you did that for a number of years, and I just would be curious for you to talk about that as training for a writer.
Well, yeah, I can only say it was great training, and it was kind of training by design. I wasn't a journalist who said, wow, I've accumulated all this kind of inside knowledge from being in police stations and courtrooms, and I should write about it. I really wanted to write crime novels first, and I went into journalism as a means to that end because of the multiple levels of that it afforded. One is obviously access to the world you want to write about. I mean, I had very little experience with police and courts and those type of things, growing up. What I knew about, I knew pretty much through fiction and some nonfiction true crime stuff. So, when you hit that moment, the light bulb goes off and you say, I want to be a writer. The next thing is, well, how do I get to that point where I feel like I'm prepared to start writing? And so in consultation with my family and so forth, I embarked on this idea that I'll become a newspaper reporter, and more specifically, I'll become a crime writer. And so that's what I did. And there's other things that weren't part of that initial strategy, but then I realized over time really kind of played into this very well. One is the writing every day, and the building of a work ethic where you write every day, and like, in a newsroom, there's no such thing as writer's block. There's never a day where you say to your editor, I don't have it. It's like, you're a writer, so you got to write. And so that was invaluable to have that kind of experience and learning how to get it going, because you had to have it going. And, and then the other aspect is that the style of journalism, short, to the point, sentences, dialogue that carries, is not fluff. It carries, when you're writing a newspaper story, especially a crime story, they never give you enough space, or inches, as they say in the newspaper business. So you learn you get an ear for dialogue, and you look for dialogue or listen for dialogue that can carry the story forward. That it contains new information. and you write short sentences that just because they're short doesn't mean they don't have what's needed in them. And I carried that over into fiction, and I think it works well. I think it's a way of building momentum in a story. And you know, that was something I couldn't have conceived of when I said, hey, I want to be a writer and I'm going to go into journalism. These are things that I've realized over time, and I think they've been very helpful to me in what I do.
Is it true, this was not on my question list, but is it true that your father wanted you to be a cop?
No.
No.
No, actually,
I read that somewhere, and
no. What happened was my father was a builder, you know, and I went up to college to kind of carry on in his footsteps or join him actually when I got out. So I was in engineering, construction engineering, and that's when I came across the Raymond Chandler books, and they pretty much changed me in about a 2-week span of reading them and rereading them. I came out of that saying I want to try to do this. So then I went home one weekend to break the news, you know, to my parents, and I had a lot of like that. I kind of had that kind of, this is not going to go well, and it turned out it went really well, because what I didn't know about my father was that he had been in an art school. He wanted to be a painter, and ended up having to drop out because he had children and he had to make a living. And so he had this kind of frustrated artistic part of himself. And so when his son came home and said, this is what I want to do, he was totally all over it. And that strategy became, how do you get to that point? And it was actually him saying, he suggested the journalism, not being, he didn't say be a cop. It was.
so I'm just trying to remember which reporter that interviewed you that I read that, but it doesn't matter. Really.
It's probably Wikipedia.
No, it was like a real person, but yeah, I like misinformation. There's well, and you have taken from, a lot of your novels have been inspired by true crime. I mean, was The Black Echo something that, it seems to me, that had come out of some of the, from being a reporter and real experience?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of serendipity has played into my life and career, but you know, I grew up in Florida, and my first jobs in newspapers were in Florida, and my first attempts to write novels were in Florida, and they were actually set in Florida, and they weren't worthy of anyone ever reading them other than me, but they were good experiences. You know, the second one was way better than the first one. And then I shifted and moved across the country to Los Angeles to work for a newspaper there. And one of the first assignments I had was to write about this, technically it would be a burglary, but these guys who went in, used the tunnels underneath the city to get beneath the bank, drilled up into a safe deposit box over a 3-day weekend and looted all the boxes. And as a reporter, I got to sit in on a briefing where the detectives on that case were briefing other detectives, and I got all these inside details on how they pulled this crime off. And that was like within a month of me moving to LA, and I suddenly realized that could be the backbone or the plot bone of another attempt to write a novel. So it came to me that way.
When you said before about your writing routine and not, and I agree with this, one can't wait for the muse because you never know if the muse is going to show up, so you just have a routine. Is it true that, or do I remember correctly that you start before dawn? Do you still do this?
Was this in the same story?
No. Actually, this was your own mythology.
That's true. No, yeah, I like to. I'm a lifelong insomniac, so I'm most often starting my day of writing, you know, while it's still dark. It's not like I set an alarm. I never set an alarm actually, but it ends up being that I start really early.
And what's your day like in terms of a writing?
Well, it really depends on where I am in a book. To me, you know, starting with most writers, starting is the hardest part, and it's about trying to find some momentum and page count, word count, all that kind of stuff. Very difficult for me at the beginning. So I'd be lucky to write or work till lunch, and then I can, any writer can find other stuff to do. That seems really important at the time. But, and then you gradually get momentum, and you're, I don't work off of an outline, so it's a way of, you kind of find the thread of where you're going. And when you get that, you're putting down more pages, more words, and momentum builds, and then your hours spread. And so, through the course of writing a book or writing a draft, I'll hit this stride, and then I'll be writing all the time, taking breaks from meals and whatever duties I have. But for the most part, writing from when I wake up to when I go to bed.
So you're an intuitive writer, if you don't outline, but do you, you have produced a book a year and sometimes more, so do you think about these books? Do you make notes? Do you just let them percolate in your mind for a while? How does that process begin?
Well, I have this misinformed idea that I don't need to put anything down on paper, that if it's good enough, I won't forget it. And I know I've forgotten lots of really good stuff. But I just don't do any kind of notes or anything. The only thing I write is the book itself. And, I think about stuff all the time. I don't think too far ahead. I think it's the newspaper. Newspapers are very contemporaneous. That, what the news today is in the paper tomorrow, or it's on the website almost right away. And I kind of carry that over. And so it doesn't serve me to think about what my, 2 books from now, this is what I'm going to do, because the world's going to be different. And hopefully these books are coming out of the world, of what's happening in the world, or a story I've heard. And so I just have never gone down that road of thinking too far ahead. And I've been somewhat forced to do it lately because of Harry Bosch's age. And so I have put stuff in the books about him being on the drop program and having a retirement date. And that's really comes out of the desire to make the books realistic. And, it was pushing, Harry's aged in real time. I've said he was born in 1950, so I knew I was pushing the limit on, how realistic is it for, a 63-year-old guy to be working homicides for LAPD, where I know in real life, the oldest guy working homicides in LAPD retired in October at 62. So I know I'm stretching my own feeling of accuracy, and so that's kind of forced me to put these things in terms of his impending retirement. But otherwise, I don't really think too far ahead.
It's funny because I talked, when Jeffrey Deaver was here, he makes these booklets with tabs and stuff, and he works on them for like a half a year before he'll come to Word. And I said, well, what happens if you decide that those 2 characters are going to be in a different place? Won't their conversation change? And he said, well, I won't do that. That won't happen. So, and I found that really an odd thing. That you wouldn't but everybody has their own process, of course. But
yeah, it's not like one.
No, I don't think
what works.
Yeah.
Works.
Yeah. You were talking about Harry Bosch. I love Harry. He's a very fraught, emotionally conflicted, sort of sad guy, but with a great, carrying the weight of the world around in his great soul. Can you, so maybe we can talk about recurring characters a little. In your case, Harry Bosch and Mickey Haller. 2 very different characters, 2 very different sides of the law, 2 different, I think, ideas about morality, one could say. I'm wondering if they just take turns with giving each other, now that Mickey Haller's coming, is he giving Harry a rest? And how you're playing them, and the idea of keeping, recurring characters alive and fresh and parole.
Well, yeah, it really all comes out of trying to keep Harry Bosch alive. What's unusual is, I just have this instinctive thing that I can't write about him all the time and still love to write about him. So over the years, I've taken breaks, and what's odd or interesting is that every now and then those breaks become bigger than Harry Bosch. And, so the Lincoln Lawyer thing took off, and the reality is I needed to write that story so I could take a break from Harry Bosch. And same thing with The Poet. I think over time, The Poet is my most popular book. and all it was an exercise. It was the first time I took a break from Harry Bosch, and it was, at that time, was really needed. And it was like, so what can I write about while I'm not thinking about Harry? And I was like, well, I spent 14 years as a reporter, so I'd write about a reporter. And, you know, so to me, everything, the outside picture is quite different. The inside picture is everything's about keeping Harry Bosch going.
Oh, really?
And so a series has grown of the Lincoln Lawyer, but to me, in my mind, it's secondary to what I'm trying to do with Harry.
So, the Lincoln Lawyer is a legal thriller, you could say, and I would think a very different kind of experience for you writing, or at least approaching that character in some way, or is that not true?
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, I've obviously never been a cop, and I've never been a lawyer.
Oh, that was in the same article with
Yeah. I've never been a cop and I've never been a lawyer, but writing about a lawyer is a lot more work. It's a lot more research, a lot more vetting done by people who do this work. I'm just more comfortable, and I guess I have more knowledge about how cops work, and there's also probably more leeway. And even though I've come to realize the law is very subjective, you know, because I'll write something in detail that a lawyer has told me this is how you would do this, and then there'll always be a lawyer who will come to a book signing and say, I would never do that, or that would not be allowed, or that would never work, you know. And then I have someone say, that was a great strategy, I'm going to use that. So I went into it thinking it was really hard and fast about how the law would be worked and applied and all that. And I came to learn something different, and that really actually made it more time consuming or more research based writing. But with Harry Bosch, I think it's more character than procedure, so I just kind of wing it. I write it. Of course, I have people that help me that really are homicide detectives, but most often I'll write the stories and then give them a manuscript or a part of a manuscript and say, you know, what do I have wrong and so forth. But that's not that. I have to do a lot more research before even starting a Lincoln Lawyer book, and most often in a situation where I'll say to one of the lawyers who helped me, this is what I need to have happen in courtroom or in legal strategy, how do I do it? And then I gather that information and then I write.
I'm loath to bring up an anecdote about how you, because it's probably not true, so I'm going to let you tell how if it's true that you met a lawyer who was somewhat reminiscent of Mickey and his style of working, and that's how that came about.
Yeah, I mean, it was the serendipity once again. I've had many stories come to me seemingly by accident, and this was actually more in the story as a character. But yeah, I went, you know, everyone goes, not everyone, but people who go to the opening day of the LA Dodgers, there's a big contingent of people that come from work in downtown, you know, so you see lots of guys in shirts and ties and stuff like that. And I went to opening day and was sitting next to a shirt and tie guy, so I started engaging him in conversation about, you know, where did he escape from, and do they know that you're at the game, that type of thing. And he said, oh, I'm my own boss and I'm a lawyer and all this stuff. And, you know, I had previously been a reporter who covered courts. So I asked him where his office was, because in LA there's 40 courthouses, and lawyers usually try to geographically situate themselves so they're working out of 4 or 5 courthouses. And that's when he said, no, I actually work out of my car. And he was very quick to say, not because I'm a failure, but that's I got this thing, I got it wired, man. There's 40 courthouses. At the time, there were, I don't know, maybe it still would be this way, but anyway, there's 4 area codes in LA, and he had cell phones with 4 cell phones with, so he could appear to be a local lawyer in his advertising, that kind of stuff. So he told me all about how he did it, and he had a copier in the car and that kind of thing. You could stop out front of any Starbucks and get their wireless, and, you know, he just had it, as he said, wired. And so I knew that would be kind of like the framework for what could be an interesting character. Pretty lucky.
Yeah. And did you stay in touch with him, particularly after you stole his life?
Yeah, I'll tell you one thing, when he was trying to convince me that he was not a bad lawyer working out of his car, he said, I actually live in Malibu, and Matthew McConaughey is my neighbor. And about 10 years later, Matthew McConaughey was playing it. So, but yeah, I stayed in touch with him, but I didn't research with him. He was a stranger to me. I got his car and I stayed in touch with him, told him what I was doing. But I had some close friends who were defense attorneys, so I did my research with them, was a fly on the wall with them. But, you know, I always told this guy what was going on, and, you know, he would come to book signings. He actually, even though they were neighbors, like in LA, you don't really know your neighbors. I actually got to introduce him to Matthew McConaughey at the premiere of the movie. And then they started talking about, oh, you're that guy. And, you know, it's always playing the bongos or whatever. So it was a very LA type thing that he had to meet his neighbor. I guess they lived 3 doors apart. At a premiere of a movie where one was playing the other.
You said a minute ago about procedural, but you said about Harry Bosch is about Harry Bosch as a character. But I thought that Gods of Guilt is totally character driven. I mean, it really feels to be. You tell me again if I'm wrong. All about Mickey Haller and his guilt and his personal life and. I mean, even there is the story, but he comes alive in a way that the book feels driven by him. No pun intended about his. You know.
Yeah, I think I've noticed it was repeating a cycle that happened with Harry Bosch. With Bosch in the 4th book, it became a character-driven series. I think Last Coyote was something that was just really about Bosch's character, and of course there was a case and all that kind of stuff, but to me, that book was about Harry Bosch, not about a crime, and I don't know what that is. We all kind of feel our way and things happen, and I think it was in order to keep this character going, I had to shift from procedural to character-driven stories, and I think that's what happened with the Lincoln Lawyer guy. This was the 5th book, but it was very similar to the process that happened with Bosch. And, you know, I look at The Last Coyote as my favorite Harry Bosch book, and I think Gods of Guilt is my favorite Mickey Haller book for those reasons. You know, I think both those books function as mysteries and thrillers or whatever, you know, whatever you have to have in one of these kind of crime novels. But I think above that is the story of this guy trying to figure out what he's doing with his life.
You know, it seems from what you're saying that you get to know a character over a sense of time, over a period of books, a series of books, and they become more alive to you until they kind of take over. That book is about them and their personality, one could say, and this book very much felt like that to me. Because there's the whole personal story with his ex-wife, his 16-year-old daughter. Can we talk about daughters actually for a minute? Because we have Harry Bosch's daughter and we have Mickey Haller's daughter. And maybe I made this up too, but you have a daughter, 16 or so, or 17?
Yeah, they're all around the same age.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, you're mining your own household, I guess, for stuff in books. You know, I take them in different ways. I think Harry has a really good relationship with his daughter in terms of them loving and respecting each other. Harry makes all kinds of wrong choices as a father because he's come from an environment where he wouldn't know what good parenting would be. And then Mickey, with Mickey, I write about the worst case scenario. I get a lot of people saying like, I'm sorry, you know, like I'm writing about my own relationship with my daughter, but I'm not. You know, they always say write what you know, but you also want to write about what you don't know or what you never want to know. You want to explore the possible bad things that can happen. And so what Mickey's going through with his daughter is me thinking about what could go awry in my own life.
Well, I always think that, and I was saying this at this conference in Key West with Gillian Flynn, who wrote Gone Girl, how people assume that anything you write is you somehow, which they don't assume about other things like painters. You know, their paintings aren't necessarily you, but they do about words. And she was quite disturbed that people would think all of those things in Gonville were about her, but, and I didn't think that you had what was going on with Mickey and his daughter, but I do think it's interesting that everything is usable in your life as that character takes on his life, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I've been using, well, every book writer like takes stuff, but it really dawned on me once when my daughter was like, I don't know, 4 or 5, and was in the back seat and in her car seat, and she's obviously looking out the window, she's learning to read and stuff, and she just says, "Dad, do you think the Burger King and the Dairy Queen are married?" And I just kind of knew, wow, there's somebody here that can really help me with my work. So I put that line in the Harry Bosch novel, and so I've been taken from her ever since.
How does she feel about that?
I think she's kind of proud of it. She's not. She's only read a few of my books, I obviously am not pushing her to read my books, at least when she's 17. But she just turned 17. But yeah, I think it's kind of cool.
Were you talking about working out of your car, and there was something that I guess when I first read The Lincoln Lawyer, I was reminded of a couple of favorite movies of Jimmy Stewart in Vertigo, driving through San Francisco, seeing the world through his windshield, Jack Nicholson in Chinatown, and then Raymond Chandler in L.A. And I wondered if any of those things had influenced you, if you thought about them at all, or the way seeing the world through a windshield. It's like seeing the world through a picture frame.
Yeah, I mean, I've never seen, and believe it or not, it's a bad thing to admit, but I've never seen that Jimmy Stewart movie.
Oh, really?
Chinatown, I would say, is my favorite movie of all time.
Me too.
And I'm very much influenced by Chapter 13 of The Little Sister by Raymond Chandler, which is a drive around Los Angeles. It has very little to do with plot of the book, but it's Marlowe having a rough day and to work out his frustration as he takes a drive. And I think that book was written in 1949, and the description fits LA today. So it's pretty wonderful, and it's something to aspire to. And so I read it quite a lot, and I'm inspired by it. And that to me is a perfect way of taking LA. It's an auto dystopia. And I think any kind of significant reporting or accounting in fiction or otherwise of the city has to take in the idea of the automobile. So that was part of what was going through my head when I met this guy at the baseball game, and why I realized that would be not only an entree into a character and how he works the city, but also a way to see the city through the smoke glass of a Lincoln Town Car. And the first we were talking about first paragraphs. The first paragraph, the Lincoln Lawyer, talks about him looking out the window of his office, not giving on that we're in a car.
Okay.
He's just looking out his window. And I thought that was a cool way of introducing that setup.
Well, it's very, it leads us directly into movies and television because it's totally a visual idea for a literary form. I actually think that, and I don't know if you'll agree, but people talk about your prose as very simple and clean, which I think is true, but I think there's a very strong visual component in your work, which I've always thought, which does lead us to movies and television. And I was curious about your involvement in the Harry Bosch Amazon TV series, which is just now premiering, is out.
Well, I had a lot of involvement in it, mostly because it's waited a long time for it, and as I've already said here, I think most of what I'm doing as a writer is wrapped around Harry Bosch, and I do these offshoots of the Lincoln Lawyer and other stories, but it's really about Harry Bosch, and so I had a totally different viewpoint of how I would deal with Harry Bosch in Hollywood. In the past, like the films have been made, and there's lots of deals that never went anywhere, but I do basically do as much due diligence as you can in determining whether the people who want to take on your work are credible, you know, what they've done before, what their reputations are. Is there anyone you know that knows them and you can talk to? Because once they have it, once you give it to them, you know, they're most like, it's like the last you'll ever hear from them in many ways. And so you want to pick the right people. And, you know, I think I've done fairly okay. You know, I had nothing to do with the Lincoln Lawyer movie except that was a high, quote unquote, high concept novel. And so there's a lot of people in Hollywood who wanted it. And I picked who I gave it to, and they ended up making a good film. So I feel like, yeah, I had nothing to do with it, but I had everything to do with it because that in somebody else's hand might have been terrible. But this time it was different. I basically said, if you want Harry Bosch, I come with it, and I'm going to have a say in everything. And if that's a problem, then there'll be someone else will come along, and it won't be a problem. And so that's what happened, you know. So I was involved as a writer, as choosing the guy who played Harry Bosch.
So you wrote the script.
I co-wrote with the guy who would be the showrunner named Eric Overmeyer, and I was the one who went to him and said, "Do you want to do this?" So I was involved in all the decisions. The guy who ends up playing Harry Bosch, named Titus Welliver, was a guy I brought to the casting room. I said, "This is a guy we should look at," and eventually he was cast. So I'm in a weird position because I think it's easy for writers to say, "Oh, God damn it, Hollywood fucked up my book," and I can't say that because I'm everything here was my choice, and so this thing goes down the tubes or critics and fans don't like it, then I can only blame myself. But I'm very happy with it. I think it's pretty good. I think it's a very good presentation of this guy that's been in books for 20 years. I like it a lot.
And so everybody can watch it now on Amazon, right? And critique it, is that right?
Yeah, Amazon is doing something no one's ever done before, no Hollywood entity, is that everything in Hollywood gets consumer tested, but usually behind closed doors. Amazon has put this pilot up for a month on their website, and you can watch it, and then you can rate it, 1 through 5 stars. And if you even want to spend more time, you can take a questionnaire. And at the end of this month, they'll crunch those numbers and decide whether to make it a series. Mm-hmm. And so it just went up about a week ago.
What's it called?
Bosch. It's called Bosch.
It's really good.
And so far, it's getting a lot of good. It's got, today, I got an email that said it's got 4,000 5-star ratings and only 32 1-star ratings. And I think all those 32 people work in Netflix.
Just since you brought it up, I mean, the fact that Harry is aging out in a way, and you have now 2 or 3 times said it's all about Harry Bosch. So what happens when Harry Bosch gets even older, if you continue to realistically age him?
Well, one thing, just talking about the show a little bit more, it's kind of given me, I don't know, some kind of like creative echo where we get to, the series, if it goes forward, is based on all the books. And so like the first season, it's not like a murder solved every week. The first season is going to be City of Bones and a partial take from Concrete Blonde. And so, and to set it in 2014 LA, there's things that are lost from the series and stuff that is gained, and it's been interesting, and in a way it's a creative boost for me to kind of re-look at Harry Bosch. You know, the Titus Welliver is 51 and we're playing him as 49. You know, so it's a different Harry Bosch than what I'm like. You know, earlier today I was writing a book for this year, a Harry Bosch book, and Harry's 63 in it. And so I'm writing about somebody different in my books, but I'm involved in this other Harry Bosch, and so it's been really invigorating and fun to kind of pick from the books what we need. You know, we're not, you know, like I said, the first season is City of Bones, but we took one of his more recent supervisors that wasn't in City Bones and made her the supervisor. So it's been fun. It's like you can take from everything whatever you need to make it as best as possible. And you know, I don't really, you know, the only thing I have a slight regret about is that he's not a Vietnam vet, because Titus Welliver's 51, and that's too young to be in Vietnam. But we've created, or we've researched and come up with a similar military experience from the Gulf Wars that he had, and so not a whole lot is lost, but the people that came back from the Vietnam War certainly came back to a different world than the people that came back from Gulf Wars, so there is something lost. But that's the only place where I've kind of felt like, you know, a little regretful about our storytelling. Otherwise, I think it's pretty cool.
Sorry.
So anyway, we got to your question about what's the future for Harry Bosch. You know, I really don't know because I don't think a lot ahead. I do know either the book I'm writing or the book I write next year. The last one is with him as a cop, as carrying a badge and a gun, which is really a big part of his identity. So I'm not sure the character can be sustained without that, but I know that has to end. My hope is, and you know, I don't plan too far ahead, but my hope is that he'll be around. And I planted a lot of seeds for other things to go forward with Harry in background or in big part and so forth. You know, his daughter wants to be a cop, so there's that. The book I'm writing right now, he has a very interesting new partner who I can see writing full books about her. You know, so there's a lot of stuff going on, and doesn't mean like we'll never see Harry again. And then I also have felt from the beginning that I wanted him to reflect what's going on in the world, in the city, at the moment I'm writing about him. And so that's one reason why he aged in real time, so he could evolve against the evolution of the city. And I've done that since 1992, and so I think when he retires, I'm relieving myself of that duty, and that will free me up to write a book about Harry in Vietnam, or Harry in 1974 as a patrolman. I've already made hints about how he crossed paths with Patty Hearst and things, you know, so I've got lots of seeds planted in these books that I can explore in many different ways. So I know it's not the end of Harry Bosch, it's just going to be a different Harry Bosch that comes out after. So.
Good, I'm glad to hear that. I was a little worried. I'm going to open it to a few questions. There's a gentleman in the back.
Do you work with the U.S. Coast Guard? Do you receive information from the U.S. Coast Guard?
No, not really. Not on a regular basis. I'm trying to think
Not on a regular basis.
if I've even used them in a story. I don't think I have. The reason I hesitate is because when I was a reporter, that was like you get thrown all kinds of little extras. Like I was a crime reporter and I mostly covered LAPD, but for some reason I was also the Coast Guard reporter, and so I had a lot of contact with them. And you know, they were always doing drug interdiction and stuff like that. So I've written quite a bit about them. I just don't think I've ever brought them into one of my books.
Somebody? No. Oh, yes.
I found it very interesting in The Gods of Guilt how you, from one chapter to another, months have gone by. And instinctively, I was like, oh my God, that's going to make, you know, if that goes on, they're going to age quickly, you know.
Right.
And I feel like, no, 2 minutes later, you know, just trying to save the life of the character. What made you decide to do it like that?
It's interesting that you picked up on that. That's the only time I've ever done that, really. And I don't know why. I mean, I did set that out as a challenge to myself because, you know, in real life, cases take forever to move through the court system, and I've always found not phony, but close to phony contraptions to constrict the stories, because I think there's a momentum in a story that, you know, it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. But you know, it's one of the things that bother me that in real life things take a long time when they get into courts, especially in LA County. And so I wanted to try to set a challenge for myself of doing that as realistically as I could. And I knew it would mean, you know, like the sections would be like months apart. And, you know, so there's a lot of stuff that happens in anyone's life in those months. And so how much of that do you put in, and how do you finesse it in without bogging down a story? And that was, to me, the big challenge of that book. And, you know, I think it worked out okay. But it is, if you look at my other books, most of my books take place in, like, you know, one book took place in 17 hours, and most of them take place in about 2 weeks. And you almost have an accounting of what happens in every day in that 2 weeks. And this was kind of refreshing to go the other way.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to, you just said you said that as a challenge for yourself. I remember years ago you saying that there's a challenge in every book, that you never want to write a book without a specific challenge in mind. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I just think it's a duty of a writer to, push the envelope in some way. And it can be small things, it can be big things. I remember we talked about The Poet. The big challenge of that was writing in first person for the first time. And I've written 4 books about Harry Bosch in third person, so I was really kind of set in my writing ways. And that was, all I went into that book was, well, it's funny, I had another challenge and I failed miserably. And it was like I had been a reporter in big city journalism for a long time, and I had never seen a show or read a book that accurately showed that world, like Lou Grant. It was like such a phony show. So I said, I'm going to teach them, I'm going to write the first very realistic journalist story. And I think that book is extremely accurate for about 150 pages. And then I realized journalists don't really solve murders, and they don't push the action really. That I said that for a joke, but the reality is it dawned on me. At all my years as a reporter, I never solved a murder, and I never pushed the action. And here I am writing about a protagonist, and the protagonist has to push the action. So then I deviated from my goal of complete accuracy and had this guy pushing the action. And so then it became a thriller, basically. So that was the lesson learned there, but I think I did do the first person pretty good.
You worked as a journalist for 14 years. At what point during the 14 years did you start writing the first novel, and how long did you wait till you quit your job?
I was writing, well, there's a lot of cops that thought I was writing fiction from the start. But, I was writing at night, writing books almost from the beginning, because I had, I went into journalism to feed the fiction, so I was feeding the fiction. So I wrote a couple books, that I said before no one's ever read, never have seen the light of day. And then I moved 3,000 miles, felt this instinctive thing to shake up my world. I moved 3,000 miles away for my 3rd time, and that became my first published book. And then I wrote 2 books, continuing as a reporter, writing at night my novels, being a reporter by day. And after the 3rd one, it's funny, I felt like this attachment, I was totally wrong, but I thought I needed my press pass to get into police stations and to get into courtrooms to get the details that I was putting into my fiction. And so I stayed longer than I should have, both creatively and financially, but I stayed for my first 3 published books. And then I took a leave of absence, only 6 months, and I promised I'd be back. And then I realized during those 6 months, when my writing had the undivided attention, I wasn't going to work in the morning to write something else. And in my mind, it just improved so much. I became very clear to me, I have to get out of this. Even if I don't have a press pass anymore, I have to get out. And because my books deserve that kind of attention. So came back from this leave, and I only lasted 6 weeks, and then I left. And that book, that was the one I said is my favorite, is The Last Coyote. That was the one I was writing. And and then the whole worry about I won't have the access was totally false, because I ended up having better access because I wasn't a threat. No matter how close you are to sources in the police department, they know you're going to write about them if they're the ones who screw up. That's my job. I had friends that were on the Rodney King tape, and I had to write about them, and I lost them as friends and sources and all that, but that was my job. So once I didn't have that one degree of threat, cops really opened up to me, because then they just saw in fiction I'm trying to write about the difficulty of their world as accurately as I can, and they just opened the door. So I lament that I stayed too long.
What other writers inspire you?
Inspire me?
Yeah.
Now, or the big 3 that I consider that brought me to the table more or less were Raymond Chandler, who we've already talked about, and Ross Macdonald and Joseph Wambaugh. And those three were really where I kind of formed my ideas about the kind of character I want to write about. And, you know, so I think Harry Bosch is a descendant of those three. I mean, two guys wrote private eye things, one guy wrote about cops, and I think Harry Bosch hopefully has characteristics of both of those kind of strains of writing. And, you know, I go back to those guys and reread their books. There's very few people, I think, that I would keep rereading books, but those three I've done that a lot. Yeah.
What would be the one thing that you would, what advice would you give to a novice writer? What is the one thing that you would encourage a novice writer?
Well, I think no matter what you do in life, you know, whether you're a writer, a carpenter, painter, whatever, you get better at it the more you do it. It's just the way it is. You learn your way around writing the more you do it. So it's kind of like the rule, you know, I'm sure it's the number one piece of advice they teach at this school, and that is if you're going to be a writer, don't think about it, don't talk about it, just write. You know, you got to do it. And it can take a while, but you see the improvements. There's two books that no one's ever seen. You know, the first one was pretty bad, the next one was better. And, you know, every writer is their own harshest critic, you know. No one had to reject those books. I knew they shouldn't go out to anyone. But by the time I wrote the third one, I knew it was going to get published. I just knew it would be published. I knew because it's the same, another piece of advice is never stop reading. That's the fuel you put in your tank. If you're going to write crime fiction, then you should be reading all kinds of crime fiction. You know, from the best stuff to stuff you hear people say, this is terrible. You read it and analyze why it's terrible, you know, and so then you don't do that. You don't make those kind of mistakes. So reading and writing are the key things, and you know, maintaining yourself as a harsh critic, you'll see your improvement from month to month.
Oh yeah, I was going to bring this up just because I'm looking over here at S.J. Roseanne, the writer. S.J. and I met on a panel, and she's already laughing, but we were on a panel with an unnamed, very well-known writer, and the topic came up, do you get better in your writing? And S.J. said, well, absolutely. And I said, well, if I didn't, I wouldn't continue writing. And this other unnamed writer said, you either have a gift or you don't have a gift, so forget it. If, you know, you're not And we were really like, really? We were so shocked by that one would feel that. I mean, it seems impossible to me. I mean, what you say is so basic to any craft that of course you're going to get better as you move.
Yeah, I mean, I you said it right there when you call it a craft. I think it really is a craft, and you know, sure you should have some talent, but I think talent is not something, when it comes to writing at least, is not something you're born with, but it's like learned through reading, and knowing what's good, and then you know, practicing your own thing, and trying to match it up with stuff that you know is good.
One last question, please. Yes. Why, it's not a great one, you don't think? Is that it?
It's a good question, but I don't think it's of interest to the general audience.
Oh, well, you'll have, oh.
Not even like that.
I just wanted to know what made you bring Harry Bosch and Mickey Holler together. And
Yeah, why I brought them together again, it comes to that thing where I really think as a writer I'm about Harry Bosch. You know, whenever I'm done writing, I think it's going to be Harry that stands for whatever I did. And so I go into every project, whether Harry's in it or not, thinking about Harry Bosch. And so when I go into an offshoot or try something new, I'm always looking for a way of linking it to Harry. And that ended up being a huge link because I started writing that book, the first book, The Lincoln Lawyer, and just thought, you know, what I'll do in here is eventually have him defend someone that Harry has arrested, and that will be the connection. But by the time I was done that book, or done a draft of that book, I suddenly realized I'm not going to be done with this guy after, you know, one or two books. I think this guy could go some distance, and he's very interesting to me, and I want to write about him some more. So I would look for a bigger way of connecting him to Harry, and you know, I went back to a book I wrote years before my second book, in which Harry, in the course of a couple pages, remembers how he came back from Vietnam, and his first investigation was actually finding out who his father was. He never knew who his father was, and he found out, and he met him one time and he was a defense lawyer, pretty well-known defense lawyer in the 50s and 60s in LA named Mickey Haller. And so he met him when he was dying, and he was invited into the house, and there was a little kid in the hallway. And so I just thought, well, that little kid could be Mickey Haller Jr. and grow up to be this lawyer, and then I have a connection that I can exploit later, as half-brothers. And it kind of looked like this master plan, but it was really all done pretty quickly, just going back and rereading that section about Harry and his father and working it out from there.
Go on, Al, fair.
Do you remember what Mickey Holler's name was then before you decided he was settled in the hallway?
It's funny, I don't, yeah, good question. I don't really remember. And like I did the first draft of the Harry Bosch books, the first book, Black Echo, I know his name was Pierce, and no first name, just Pierce, and that was coming off of one of Raymond Chandler's essays about the investigator having to pierce all veils of society, so I could just call him Pierce. And then I came across, I can't remember the reference, but I studied Hieronymus Bosch's paintings in college, and I came back to something came up on the radar about Hieronymus Bosch, and it started me thinking that would be a better name than Pierce. And so I did that. And then years later, I did a book called Chasing the Diamond, and that guy's name was Pierce, so I ended up using it.
I was just going to ask you about Hieronymus Bosch, and why, can you go like a couple of sentences more as to why he chose the painter's name?
Well, I mean, if you're aware of the painter, his work, it's all about a world gone wrong and wages of sin. And there's a lot of religious stuff in it, but for the most part, it's a world gone wrong. And so my idea was that's like a crime scene. And
Like the Garden of Earthly Delights.
And the Garden of Earthly Delights is kind of like a contemporary Los Angeles. So I was drawing all these connections that, may be a little strained, but they were there. And so I just went with that. And I've always liked the name Harry, and so I thought Harry, short for Hieronymus. And little did I know, even though I had studied him in college, that Hieronymus is the Latin derivative of Jerome, so Harry should be called Jerry, but it's too late to go back.
Don't leave. Just follow Michael to the back, get a book, have him sign it, have a glass of wine, and thank you very, very much. And thank you.
Thank you.